had never anticipated that I would find myself in this predicament at the age of 62. Life, after all, was supposed to be predictable by this point. I spent my mornings ministering to my garden, my afternoons reading quietly, and my evenings spending time with my husband, Mark, as we reflected on the years that had passed. However, one evening a private conversation altered everything, prompting me to query my preconceived notions. It all began with a corporate gala that was hosted by Mark's organization. Over the course of 3 decades, he had labored there, advancing through the ranks with unwavering commitment. Richard Caldwell, his supervisor, was a man of calm authority with whom I had only exchanged polite greetings at previous events. He was tall, distinguished, and in his mid-60s, exuding a calm confidence that appeared effortless. The elegantly dressed attendees were enveloped in a warm glow from the magnificent chandeliers of an upscale hotel in downtown Chicago, where the gala was held. The room was alive with the gentle melody of a live jazz band in the corner, the clinking of glasses, and the conversation. I was not particularly fond of these functions. I preferred the comfort of home. However, Mark had insisted, so I donned a modest navy blue dress and consented to accompany him. At first, everything appeared to be entirely conventional. Mark was preoccupied with discussions with his colleagues, while I engaged in conversation with the other spouses. That was until Richard approached me. "Evelyn, may I have a moment?" he inquired, his deep voice piercing through the hubbub of the room. I hesitated. A moment? What could Mark's supervisor possibly desire from me? However, I followed him as he guided me through a side corridor that was separate from the main ballroom, smiling graciously and nodding. The air was more tranquil in this location, as the gala sounds receded into the distance. He directed me to a private lounge, a cozy space that featured a fireplace, subdued lighting, and leather armchairs. The tension in the air was perceptible but undeniable. I could detect a slight increase in my pulse rate as I sat across from him. "I trust that I am not detracting from any significant matters," he expressed with a timid, almost apprehensive smile. "I assure you that I am not," I replied, despite the nagging curiosity that was brewing within me. He sighed and rubbed his hands together, as if he were seeking for the appropriate words. Eventually he spoke. "It is about Mark." At that moment, I straightened in my chair, my stomach tightening. "Is something amiss?" He hesitated. "Not quite. However, there is one thing I believe you should be aware of." I could sense the significance of his words even before he spoke them. The seriousness of his expression disturbed me, and the calm intensity caused my pulse to quicken. "Evelyn," he continued, his voice compassionate yet firm, "I have known Mark for a long time. I have observed him establish his professional vocation, provide assistance to his colleagues, and prioritize his family. In the midst of it all, I have observed something." I forced myself to breathe forcefully. "What is it?" His gaze was fixed on me as he leaned forward slightly. The words struck me like a heavy stone in my chest, and I felt an immediate wave of defensiveness rise within me. "You don't understand," I stammered. Richard nodded in agreement. "I am aware that Mark is a devoted spouse. However, Evelyn, when was the last time he truly saw you? Not merely as his wife, but as the extraordinary woman you are." I attempted to respond, but no words emerged. He persisted, his tone becoming more subdued. "I have observed the manner in which you regard him when he is preoccupied and unable to pay attention. I have observed you standing in the background at events such as these, while he becomes absorbed in his work. You provide so much, but does he reciprocate?" A lump formed in my esophagus. I wanted to protest, to inform him that he was mistaken, but a part of me was hesitant to do so. "I do not intend to overstep," Richard stated, slightly reclining. I exhaled slowly, my mind racing. Richard studied my features, then offered a small, knowing smile. But sometimes an outsider sees what those inside cannot. The words, "Evelyn, you deserve to be seen," touched a chord within me that I was unaware existed. I was uncertain about my emotions for the first time in a long time. I was rendered immobile as I remained seated. Richard's words resonated in my consciousness, prompting an emotion that I was not prepared to confront. Had I truly gone unnoticed for so long? I wanted to dismiss his words as a mere observation, a well-intentioned but misguided attempt at kindness. However, I knew in my heart that he was correct. Mark, a hardworking provider, was a good man. He had always been dependable and steady. However, in the quiet moments that mattered, when had he last truly looked at me? When had he last noticed the small ways I tried to keep our life warm and full? The way I folded his shirt so that he enjoyed it. I cleared my throat, pushing down the lump that had settled there, and reflected on the way I had surrounded our home with his favorite items and stood by his side through every career triumph. Richard. He extended his hand to prevent me from continuing. I apologize for causing you any discomfort, Evelyn. However, I was unable to remain silent and express my gratitude. I exhaled slowly. Your candor is greatly appreciated. I finally spoke, albeit with a gentler tone than I had intended. However, Mark and I have been together for decades, and marriage is about more than mere appearances. It pertains to stability and dedication, Richard affirmed. I comprehend, and I appreciate that. His gaze was unwavering as he leaned forward slightly. However, have you ever considered what you genuinely desire? The question lingered in the space between us. What I desired? For an extended period of time, I had been preoccupied with the duties of our marriage, the requirements of Mark, and the expectations that were placed upon me. I had never taken the time to contemplate my own desires. Richard, this is an unusual conversation to be having at a corporate gala. He smiled at the thought. I let out a small, nervous chuckle. I assume it is. However, I was compelled to express myself. A brief period of silence ensued, punctuated only by the gentle crackle of the fireplace. He exhaled and stood up, stating, I should allow you to return. I also stood, smoothing my dress with slightly trembling hands. Richard nodded, but his expression was inscrutable. Evelyn had only promised me one thing. Indeed, Mark will be curious as to my whereabouts. I cocked my head. What is that? Do not disregard my statement. Rather, contemplate it. I hesitated before slowly nodding. That's fine. He gave me a small smile before stepping aside and gesturing toward the door. I could still feel the weight of the conversation pressing on my chest as I walked past him, and the warmth of his presence beside me. Upon my return, the gala was still in full motion, and Mark was exactly where I had left him, engaged in a conversation with his colleagues. At first, he failed to acknowledge my presence. I observed him from a distance for a brief period. His countenance was animated, and his hands were in motion as he spoke. It was an aspect of him that I had always admired, his passion and drive. However, I then considered Richard's statement. Had Mark ever looked at me in that manner? When he finally glanced over and observed me standing there, he gave me a slight nod before returning to his conversation. I felt a change within me. Richard had planted a seed, and despite my efforts to disregard it, I could sense that it was already sprouting. The journey home was tranquil. Mark sat beside me, his hands firmly gripping the wheel and his gaze fixed on the dark road ahead. The city lights flashed by in a blur, but my mind was elsewhere. Richard's words continued to reverberate in my mind, his voice lingering in a way that I could not dislodge. You are entitled to be observed. I briefly observed Mark, who appeared fatigued, with the slightest hint of tension between his eyebrows. In the nearly 40 years that we had been married, I had memorized every detail of his face, including the sharp lines of his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, and the way his lips pressed together in concentration. However, when was the last time he had truly looked at me? He cleared his throat, dispelling the silence. Was your evening enjoyable? This inquiry caught me off guard. It was a question he asked after each event, gathering, and dinner party, almost as if it were a matter of obligation rather than genuine curiosity. I hesitated before responding. It was intriguing. He nodded absently. Good, he said, and the conversation concluded abruptly. I redirected my attention to the window, observing the city dissipate as we progressed toward the tranquil suburbs. Upon our arrival home, Mark performed his customary routine. He removed his jacket, placed his keys on the counter, and retired to his office for one final review of his emails. I remained in the kitchen for an extended period, gazing at the void where he had been. Mark had always been this way, dedicated to his work and steady in his routines. I was not angry with him, not precisely. He had provided me with a secure and enjoyable existence. However, Richard's words had triggered a memory within me that I was unable to suppress. I proceeded to the bedroom and observed my reflection in the mirror. I was 62 years old, and my once auburn hair now bore silver strands. My face was adorned with faint lines, serving as a reminder of the years I had lived. However, my pupils remained unchanged, and I observed something that I had not observed in a long time: loneliness. This quiet fading into the background, this gradual slipping into routine, I had always assumed was just part of aging. But now, for the first time, I pondered, was it? The next morning, as Mark left for work, he kissed me on the cheek and said, "I'll be home late." I nodded and offered a small smile, acknowledging the significant client encounter. "Everything is in order. Be cautious." Subsequently, he vanished. I remained in the entryway for an extended period before returning inside. Typically, I would occupy my day with errands, housework, or gardening. However, today I was restless. Before I could convince myself otherwise, I reached for my phone and dialed a number that I had never intended to call. Richard responded on the second ring. "Evelyn?" His voice was tinged with a hint of astonishment. I exhaled slowly. "Do you have time for a cup of coffee?" I inquired. A moment of silence ensued, followed by a soft "of course." An hour later, I found myself seated across from him at a tranquil cafe located near the lake. The air was infused with the aroma of freshly baked pastries and roasted coffee beans. The autumn leaves swayed in the breeze, and Richard gazed at me with a quiet fascination. "I was uncertain as to whether I would receive a response from you." I observed the swirls of cream as they merged with the black liquid as I stirred my coffee. "I was uncertain as to whether I would contact you." He waited, nodding. I slowly exhaled. "I have been contemplating your words." His expression remained unintelligible, and I hesitated before meeting his gaze. "You were correct." I was unable to identify the flickering in his eyes. "Evelyn, I am not expressing regret for my life," I interrupted tenderly. "Mark and I have established a genuine, robust partnership. But at some point, I believe I lost the ability to desire something for myself." Richard leaned forward slightly, and I swallowed hard. "I am uncertain at this time." A silence ensued between us, punctuated only by the faint murmur of conversation in the distance. Richard eventually spoke, his voice hushed. It was a man who had no reason to interfere in my life or to say the things he had, except that he had observed something in me that even I had not. "I simply wanted you to be happy." I looked at him, really looked at him. Suddenly, I came to the realization that I had a decision to make. I sat there, gazing at Richard across the small cafe table, my hands encircling the warm ceramic of my coffee cup. "I merely desire for you to be content." The words he spoke hung in the air, heavy yet gentle, like a truth I had been evading for an excessive amount of time. For years, I had convinced myself that contentment was sufficient, and that security, stability, and loyalty were the foundations of a fulfilling existence. And they were. However, Richard had discovered an additional aspect of me that I was unaware was absent: a desire to experience emotion. I exhaled slowly, feeling the burden of my thoughts. "Richard, I am at a loss as to how to proceed with this." His eyes regained their luster. "Evelyn, you are not required to intervene. Think about what brings you joy. When was the last time you engaged in an activity solely for your own benefit?" I hesitated to respond, as I had dedicated decades to guaranteeing Mark's career, goals, and world were unharmed. I had established a life of order and routine, but what about myself? I sipped my coffee, the rich, acrid warmth that anchored me for a moment. I am uncertain of my identity beyond my marriage. Richard offered me a slight, knowing smile as I confessed that the words had taken me by surprise. Perhaps it is time to investigate further. I exhaled a trembling, breathless chuckle. That may be terrifying. However, it was also thrilling, don't you think? I refrained from responding, as I was aware that he was correct. The world outside continued to move as it always had, with cars passing, people laughing, and the wind rustling the golden autumn foliage. We sat in silence for a while. Life did not provide an opportunity for introspection. However, perhaps for the first time, I required it. Consequently, I relinquished my cup and gazed into his eyes. Richard, I am uncertain about the future. However, I am certain that I must begin to relive my life. His lips curled into a smile. That was all I intended for you to comprehend. When Mark returned home that evening, I was already seated at the kitchen table, anticipating his arrival. He scarcely acknowledged me as he deposited his briefcase and adjusted his tie. He muttered, "Long day. I am fatigued." I observed him for a moment. This man with whom I had shared a life and loved for decades. However, as he traversed the residence, I failed to perceive the expanse of space that had developed between us over the years. I exhaled deeply and inquired, "Mark, would you like to engage in conversation?" He hesitated before turning to me. "About what?" I swallowed. "About us?" His brows furrowed slightly. "What about us?" I hesitated, then spoke the words that had been slowly accumulating inside me since last night. "Mark, I feel as though I am invisible." He blinks. "What is the matter?" "I feel as though I have spent years as the wife who maintains the stability of our life, who supports you, and who ensures that everything is in order. And I do adore you. However, at some point, I ceased to be visible." He frowned, evidently taken aback. "Evelyn, where does this originate?" I shook my head. "It has been present for an extended period of time. However, I have never permitted myself to express it aloud." He sat across from me, massaging his face with his hand. "I was unaware that you harbored such sentiments." I conducted a thorough examination of him. "Have you ever considered this?" He was silent. And in that instant, I came to the realization that Mark was not a bad husband. He did not intend to be cruel or neglectful. Rather, he had presumed, as I had, that marriage entailed a predictable existence. This level of comfort was sufficient. This was not love, it was not living. We no longer needed to check in on each other in the same manner. His voice was cautious as he finally inquired, "What are you saying?" I now breathed profoundly. I must resume living for myself. His expression became slightly apprehensive. "Are you disclosing me?" I hesitated before shaking my head. "I am uncertain about the future, Mark. However, I am certain that I cannot continue to present myself in this manner. Additionally, if we are to preserve this marriage, we must implement a change." He gazed at me for an extended period of time, and for the first time in years, I observed a momentary glimmer in his eyes of realization. Perhaps we had the opportunity to rectify this. Alternatively, we did not. However, for the first time in decades, I was prepared to discover the truth. Like what you heard. There's plenty more heartbreak and secrets to come. Hit like, subscribe, and stay curious with Tangled Truths.